On the night of the 17th of February 1861, Richard Furlong was stabbed to death in the town of Evandale, Tasmania. Now the police had one man in their sights, a man named Patrick Malone, also known as the priest. But the reports of what happened that night are questionable and throw doubts upon the official narrative. Who was the victim? What was his relationship with the priest? How did the story end? This is the story of an unholy incident in Evandale. The story begins almost a year earlier on the 14th of February in 1860 when Patrick Malone, who's working as a labourer, decides he's had enough of that life, he's going to do his own thing. He heads off into the bush. The Tasmanian Convict Department puts out an advertisement in the Tasmanian newspaper The Mercury, offering a £2 reward for any information leading to his capture. He's described as 5'5", 35 years of age. He has grey eyes, brown hair, and an unhealthy yellow complexion. He's described as having several distinctive tattoos, including a crucifix and several shamrocks. Now, the article describes him as being a convict that travelled to Australia from Ireland aboard the Emily II, which was a convict transport ship which travelled twice to Van Diemen's Land in 1842 and then again in 1844. Looking at the passenger list, he does not appear, but it is possible that he changed his name at some point. Now, for a year, his actions are largely unknown until on the 17th of February 1861 at 7 a.m, he and a young woman named Eliza Wiggins show up at a property owned by the Colgrave family in Evandale, seeking lodgings. Not a lot is known about his companion Eliza Wiggins. An article dated 1859 outlines how she was arrested for public drunkenness and fined 10 shillings. How her and the priest became companions is completely unknown. Now, Eliza and the priest end up getting lodgings at the Colgrave property around 7:30 a.m. on that morning. Mrs. Colgrave, who manages the property along with her husband, recalls seeing the priest with ammunition and gunpowder. They hang around the property until 7 p.m. that night, at which point the priest leaves the property, leaving Eliza behind. Now, Richard Furlong, the victim, arrives at the property half an hour later after the priest leaves. He's accompanied by two other people, a lady who's loudly proclaiming to be his wife, and an older gentleman by the name of Patrick Malone. Now, Richard Furlong and his supposed wife are drunk. They've been celebrating for some unknown reason. They arrive at the property asking for lodgings. Now, not long after, the priest returns to the property at 8:30. He's overheard having a conversation with Richard Furlong's supposed wife, where she asks him how long he's staying, and he says, "I'm just here for the night." Now, at 9 p.m, after some more drinking, Richard Furlong's party decide to go to bed. And strangely, Eliza Wiggins joins them in their room. The priest, however, takes a bed in an adjoining room on his own. Now, Mrs. Colgrave, the owner of the house, does the rounds, extinguishing candles, locking doors. She reports all the tenants as being quiet and respectful. Now, what happens from this point is highly contested. What we do know is that at 11:30 p.m, Mrs. Colgrave is awoken to screams of murder. She rushes from her bed, gets a candle, heads down to the lodgings, and as she approaches the door, she can hear two men asking to be led out of the room. She unlocks the door, and the older gentleman, Mr. Malone, and the priest rush from the room. They both say that they're heading off to find a doctor. Mrs. Colgrave goes into the room, and as she enters, she sees Richard Furlong slumped over a bed with a knife wound to his stomach and his intestines hanging out. The next half an hour is chaotic, but eventually Patrick Malone arrives with the police, and soon after a doctor arrives. The priest, however, is nowhere to be seen. Richard Furlong survives for several hours after his initial stab wound, but eventually passes away in hospital. The priest goes on the run. He's eventually caught on the 10th of April 1861. Now, his arrest is primarily driven by testimony given by the elderly Patrick Malone, who was in the room during the stabbing, along with the lady who claimed to be Richard Furlong's wife and Eliza Wiggins. Now, it's worth noting that neither of the two women were questioned by police, and neither of them made a statement. Now, in Malone's statement, he says inside the room there were 3 beds. He took a single bed, Richard Furlong and his supposed wife took a double bed, and Eliza Wiggins took a single bed of her own. Now, Malone testifies that soon after they went to bed, Mrs. Colgrave did the rounds, and she actually told them off because she thought that they were being too loud and rowdy. She leaves a candle going in the room, locks the door, and heads off for the night. He says that a few hours passed, the candle dwindled down to nothing, and eventually he heard a scratching at the door, as if someone was trying to gain entry. He whispers to Furlong, "Hey, someone's trying to get into the room. Can you go see who it is?" Furlong, in his drunken state, tells Malone to go back to sleep. You're imagining things. But eventually the scratching sound comes again, and Furlong is convinced to go answer the door, see who's there. When he opens the door, Malone states that the priest is standing on the other side. In one hand, he's got a knife, in the other, a gun. Furlong asks him, "What are you doing here?" And Malone states that the priest told him to get out of the way. "I'm not here for you." Furlong, however, says, "No way, you're not coming in the room. I'm not letting you come in." Now at this point, somehow, Furlong gets hold of a large stick and it hits the priest across the face with it, cutting open his head. The two end up wrestling, and in the process, Furlong falls on top of the priest and ends up stabbed in the stomach. And it's at this point that Mrs. Colgrave, asleep upstairs, hears screams of murder. Now, Malone's testimony to the police is enough to convince them that the priest is guilty of the crime. Now, what's interesting is that Furlong refuses to make any sort of statement at all to the police or to the hospital staff while they're trying to save his life. The police never question Eliza Higgins or Furlong's supposed wife as to what happened inside that room, and it leaves many unanswered questions. For instance, why did Eliza, who originally arrived with the priest, join Furlong's party? Who was the mystery lady proclaiming to be Furlong's wife? Did one of Furlong's party actually commit the stabbing? On the 16th of April, the priest was tried and found guilty of murder by a jury in Launceston, and he was sentenced to death. A week later, he and two other murderers were hung for their crimes. Now, reports by people who were there that day of the hanging report as he stood on the gallows, he kissed the rope before it went around his neck, and he said a prayer, and he died quickly and silently.